Folks, welcome. Excellent. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everyone, to the latest edition of Democrats Live, the ADA anniversary edition of Democrats Live, the 27th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm Tom Perez. I have the privilege of being the chair of the DNC. Welcome to the live stream audience for today's program, and we are streaming at live.democrats.org, where people can also go to sign up, take action, donate, and in addition, we need you to advocate. That's what we're doing today, and you can get on makecalls.democrats.org/ACA, makecalls.democrats.org/ACA. If you get on that, that will give you easy directions on contacting senators to tell them to make sure that they don't do a thing on this Trump care bill. I don't know what they call it, Trump care, Ryan care, McConnell care. I'll tell you what I call it. I don't care, because they don't appear to care about the people that they're affecting. President Trump called the House version, which is what they're considering right now, a motion to proceed, which is what passed the Senate, is technically a motion to proceed with the House bill. The House bill is what Donald Trump called mean. The Senate bill, or there were many bills, was meaner and even meaner and even meaner. So we're debating mean versus meaner versus even meaner. And I'll tell you, as we come here today to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and its transformational and bipartisan nature, I can't help but reflect on my first opportunity in 2010. That was my first anniversary as a Obama appointee, and it happened to be the 20th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we had a bipartisan celebration. And there was a lot to celebrate back then. We had Dick Thornburgh there. We had his remarkable wife. Like Dick Thornburgh, I married up. And the Thornburghs have been titans in the disability rights movement, as you well know. We had Tom Harkin there. We had Steny Hoyer there. We had so many of the serial activists who brought us the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we had a proactive agenda from President Obama, making sure we gave meaning, for instance, to the Olmstead decision, which stands for the proposition, as people know, that the inappropriate institutionalization of people with disabilities is a form of discrimination under the ADA. And the Olmstead decision from 1999 was really the Brown versus Board of Education for the disability rights movement. And I'm proud of the work that the Obama administration did to give meaning to that important Supreme Court decision. And the reality is we couldn't give meaning to that decision without Medicaid, because Medicaid was the principal funder of our efforts to make sure that people with disabilities who can and want to live in the community live in freedom. We should tell the Freedom Caucus that freedom for people with disabilities is living and living a life of their choice, living a life of purpose in the community. That's what we should be doing. And so that is what we were talking about in 2010 in a bipartisan fashion. It brings me great sadness to have this ADA anniversary 7 years later, when there's no such thing as bipartisanship. The Senate version of the Affordable Care Act, the Senate version that passed, contained 143 amendments from Republicans. There were 100 hearings. It was the longest hearing markup in something like 20 years. But here, 13 men got together to talk about whether women's maternity benefits should be part of the suite of services that are so-called essential services. And I don't mean to lecture here, but the enormity of the situation cannot be overstated. Because, make no mistake about it, this is not a health care bill that is being debated in the United States Senate. It's a tax cut bill masquerading as a health care bill. A tax cut bill for very wealthy people and certain corporations who don't need or deserve a tax cut. And that is why this anniversary, while it is perhaps one of the most serious and sober anniversaries, is coming at a very important time. Because one thing I've learned about the disability rights community is y'all know how to advocate. Whether it's nickel, whether it's ADAPT, whether it's AAPD, whether it's everybody else, whether it's the Joyce Benders of the world, everyone, we know that disability rights movement. And you know what? The disability rights movement does what John Lewis says we need to do when we're trying to advocate for change. We cause good trouble. And so that's what we're going to do. And so what we want to do today here, we have two remarkable guests that reflect so much of what the disability rights movement is about. Our first guest needs no introduction at all. He's one of my heroes, and he's a hero to folks in the disability rights movement, in the labor movement, in the fairness movement. And his name is Tom Harkin, the retired U.S. Senator from Iowa, and darn, we miss him. Senator Harkin, welcome to Democrats Live. And we are equally excited to have Keri Gray, who's the program manager for the Rising Leaders Initiative at the U.S. Business Leadership Network, which is a critical partner in ensuring access to opportunity for good middle-class jobs for people with disabilities. So, Keri, thank you for joining us here today. It's an honor to have you here. And so let me start out with both of you by asking the simple question for the benefit of our listeners, which is, how did you get involved in the disability rights movement? What stoked your passion? And Senator, let me start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Chairman Perez, for doing this and for chairing this great Democratic Party. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank you also for your wonderful stewardship of the Department of Labor for all those years in the Obama administration. Thank you. It was great working with you, and I wish you were back there.
Well, I wish you were in the Senate, because they traded down.
Well, I guess, look, I've told the story many times about my brother Frank and Nickel, by the way, the National Council on Independent Living, National Center on Independent Living, gives an annual award in his name on independent living. My brother was deaf and became deaf as a result of an illness at a very young age. He was only about 6 years old. And the state came and took him out of his home, sent him halfway across the state to a school which they called the School for the Deaf and Dumb. First of all, it was very traumatic that he had the illness and became totally deaf, couldn't hear anything. Then to be taken from his home and sent across the state to live with people he didn't know. And I remember one time later on when he was in high school, said to me, he said, you know, I may be deaf, but I'm not dumb. And there's two things my brother said to me in his lifetime. That was one. The other one was, he said, look, the only thing I know I can't do is hear. There may be other things I can't do, but I don't know what they are until I try them. I just know I can't hear. And so when he went to the school, when he graduated, they offered him three choices. He could be a baker, a shoe cobbler, or a printer's assistant. And they asked him which one he wanted to do. And he said, I don't want to do any of that. They said, okay, now you're going to be a baker. No options, no choices, nothing for the future. So he became a baker, which he didn't like. But he was a pretty good baker, by the way. But he didn't like it. He finally got the opportunity to get employment in a job that he really liked. And this is, I'll try to tell the story very rapidly. He was a baker in a small bake shop in West Des Moines, Iowa. A man kept coming in the morning and would try to talk to him. My brother would write down and say, I'm deaf, can't hear, write it down. And so they established a kind of a relationship. The guy asked him, after couple of months, this guy asked my brother Frank, how do you like being a baker? And my brother said, I hate it. He said, well, what do you allowed to do? He said, I like to work with machines. I'm good with my hands. I can do machines. And the guy said, well, I have a business. That's what I do. His name was Mr. Delavan. He had a manufacturing company. They made jet engine nozzles for jet engines. It's all done by robots today, but in those days, you had to work on fine machines and drills, and it had to be really just perfect. He hired Frank. As he told me later, I didn't know him at that time, as he told me later, I just felt sorry for him. So I wanted to hire him, give him something else to do. So he took him down to the place, got his foreman, said, this guy's deaf, put him to work on a machine, see what he can do. Mr. Delavan told me later he came back, several weeks later, came back and asked his foreman, how's that Harkin doing? And the foreman said, my God, this guy's fantastic. He shows up on time all the time. He makes fewer mistakes. He makes no mistakes. He puts out more parts per hour, and they're perfect. Well, they thought this was amazing. So Mr. Delavan told me later, he said, so I started observing this. And he said, it finally dawned on me. This was a very noisy place. A lot of banging and clanging and bells and machines and people yelling. Didn't bother my brother a bit. He just kept right on working. Finally, it dawned on Delavan, wait a minute. I should be hiring more deaf people. And he did. He went out, he said, the first one was out of the goodness of my heart. I went out and hired more people because it helped my bottom line. They were the best workers I ever had. So that's how I got involved. I thought, how many more Frank Harkins are there out there? And then my nephew, I'll close up, my nephew, Kelly, 19 years old, got injured, became severely paraplegic. He called me up one day. I was in the House of Representatives. Uncle Tom. He said, I got a problem. I need your help. I said, what's that? He said, I'm in college at Fort Collins, Colorado State University. There's a course I want to take. It's on the second floor, and there's no elevator, and I can't get my wheelchair there, and they won't let me take the course. I said, this is crazy. This is nuts. And so finally it started dawning on me, wait a minute. There's this lack of civil rights for people with disabilities, all kinds of disabilities, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, hidden disabilities. So after that, I said, that's what I want to do. I got to get involved in this. This is wrong. We got to change the laws, and we've got to break down these barriers. We need a broad civil rights bill for all people with disabilities. That's how I got involved. Oh.
Keri, tell us about your journey.
Definitely. I also want to thank everyone who allowed this platform to exist so that we can talk about the ADA, celebrate our history and our culture, and also talk about the impacts of what it's done to this current generation, Generation ADA. I'm very happy to be somewhat of a representative of that and very thankful to live a lifetime after all of the hard work that was put into it. So I just want to thank everyone for that. Mm-hmm. So my introduction to disability was when I was even younger. I was diagnosed with cancer, osteosarcoma bone cancer in my right leg. And after undergoing treatments in hospitals, I ended up having an amputation on my right leg and hearing loss and a couple of other things going on. And that was my introduction to disability, but it took me a long time to have anything to do with disability, if I'm going to be honest, which I don't think is an uncommon story for many people with disabilities. Unfortunately, our community is still filled with a lot of stigma, a lot of shame, and a lot of just figuring out how can we exist as who we are and feel comfortable in our own skin. And so it wasn't until I was 20 years old, 12 years later, even though that's still a young age, that's still 12 years of me hiding of who I was and what happened to me, being not celebrating any of my accomplishments of life. So it wasn't until I was in college that I was able to interact with communities, much like Senator Harkins expressed, or organizations such as the American Association of People with Disabilities, NICL, and now the USBLN have been instrumental to my life. I was able to interact with people of all different types of disabilities that I had never seen in a positive light before. I saw folks with, canes and wheelchairs and invisible disabilities, and come to find out they had things going on, and I saw them not, looked upon in a pity way, not looked upon in a, a stereotypical way, but I saw them doing really amazing things. They were working at the White House. They were working in the private sector. They were dreaming and just going to school and things that I associated with myself with. And I mean, even though now today it's weird to think that that was a surprise, it was very much a surprise for me. So when I encountered the fact that not only is disability something that exists, but there's a community behind it, that there's a history behind it, that there is legislation and advocacy behind disability, that took on a whole new meaning for me. That meant that I not only had a physical attribute, but I had people who supported and understood the things that I struggled with, the things that I need to fight for, and the things that I need to celebrate. And when I discovered that there was a community and a history and a legacy behind disability is when I realized I had to be a part of the process. So from that point, I did everything that I could to intersect my work with, not only my advocacy for very much I identify with being a Black woman with social change and racial disparities and feminisms and things of that nature, but I realized it was imperative to include disability a part of that and to figure out how I could be a part of a change in a world that was encompassing of all of our struggles and knowing that we all exist simultaneously. So it was that introduction and that wide awakening and learning about the background that I was able to be introduced to disability rights.
Wow.
Thank you for your leadership. Tell me about your current job. What do you do in your current job?
Yeah, so I currently work for an organization called the U.S. Business Leadership Network. We go by the USBLN, and we work with the private sector to ensure that disability policies are active and building in the private sector. I specifically work with college students and recent graduates all across the country. I work with about 200 students, and we do a mentoring program. We also run an academy in conjunction with our annual conference, and the goal of this is very much what Senator Harkins expressed earlier, of showcasing talent and employment in the disability pipeline. And so we make a clear connection between students with disabilities and the employment sector and how our unique perspectives, our talents, our skills very much create innovation and very much build upon the productivity of any organization and any business. So I'm very happy to do this work.
Well, it's always nice when you can get a business to focus on the last 7 letters of the word disability instead of the first 3 letters.
Definitely.
And that's what you have demonstrated.
Thank you.
Senator, when we reflect on this 27th anniversary of the ADA, for me, the first thing that jumps off the page is its bipartisan nature, which was indispensable for its passage, whether it was George Herbert Walker Bush, Boyden Gray, Dick Thornburg, along with yourself and Tony Coelho and Steny Hoyer, and then so many serial activists out there, some who are still with us, some who are here in spirit, like Justin Dart. And I can't help but note the tragic irony between the bipartisan nature of the passage of the ADA and what just occurred in the United States Senate, which was 50 plus the vice president voting to begin debate on a bill they don't really know what's in. But what we do know is it affects 1/6 of the economy. What we do know is that for people with disabilities, Medicaid has been the key to independence.
That's right.
And part of the reason they don't really know is because many of these senators have deliberately avoided meeting with their constituents, because God forbid they heard the truth from their constituents about how their children on the autism spectrum are getting critical services that enable them to stay in the home, or their waiver program enables them to live in a community-based setting instead of being warehoused in an institution. And the list goes on. And so for people listening today, it's conceivable that they don't have as much context on the interaction between the ADA and Medicaid. And those were two areas where you you played such a big role. So what is the impact of a repeal on a person with a disability?
Well, first of all,
and Medicaid in particular.
And Medicaid. First of all, I have to get back to something you said in your opening about this being a tax bill. Folks, here it is. In this bill, there's $541 billion in tax cuts that mainly go to the rich. At the same time, there's $772 billion cuts to Medicaid over the same period of time. That's a 26% cut in Medicaid. And you know, Medicaid, as I've said so many times, it's sort of the key to the freedom for people with disabilities. It's the key to their freedom, as you said, Mr. Chairman, to live in the community and not be housed in a nursing home or someplace. It's the key to education. So many people with disabilities need that Medicaid wraparound services so they can go to school and get educated. It's the key to their freedom for employment. Now, there's this mistaken idea, I think, among a lot of people that if you're on Medicaid, you can't work. That's not true. If you're on Medicaid, you can still work. But if you don't have the Medicaid, you'll never be able to get to work and have the supportive systems you need to be a tax-paying member of society. So this bill that they're debating in the Senate and what the House passed is a dagger to the heart of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I would never have expected, after 27 years, and 2 years ago we had wonderful 25-year celebrations all over America. I went to a lot of them in cities around America. All the great strides we've made in so many ways to break down these barriers. The whole ADA generation, I call them, these young people like Keri. I'm glad you have the outgoing and the incoming here today.
No, we're both millennials also, Senator. Although that's probably an alternative fact in the opinion of a certain someone.
But for someone like me who's been around for so long, it's so great to see someone like Keri. She's so bright, so effusive, so smart, so eloquent. Look, we're going to get through this, and we're going to get through it because of people like Keri, I'll tell you that.
Amen.
But this bill, the cuts to Medicaid, and you all know this, when you cut a program like Medicaid, the most vulnerable get hit the worst. And so people with the most severe disabilities who need Medicaid the most will be the first to be cut in the states. That's just the way it happens. And they're the most vulnerable, and usually they're the poorest of the poor. And they don't have the kind of support, legal kinds of backgrounds, back supports that can help them get through it. And so if you believe, and I say this to America, if you believe in the Americans with Disabilities Act and what it has done to break down barriers, to provide opportunities and futures for people with disabilities, this ADA generation that grew up under the ADA that now know they can pursue employment, they can live on their own, they can have families, they can partake of society. Now, if you vote for this bill, you're putting a dagger in that heart of the ADA. Tom, I got to tell you, I don't understand for the life of me how some senator who was there when we passed the ADA and who was there when we passed the ADA Act amendments and supported it can now turn around and support this bill. It just takes away everything that we fought for in terms of providing those supportive systems for people with disabilities to lead full, meaningful, integrated lives in our society. It's painful. All I can say is I hope that when the Senate finally comes to a vote on this bill, that it goes down in flames and that it's not passed, even though they passed the motion to proceed. I hope And I pray the Senate will come to its senses and stop this nonsense that's coming out of this Trump White House and this Trump care.
Well, I believe in the power of prayer, and I also believe in the power of advocacy. Make calls.democrats.org/ACA. Make calls.democrats.org/ACA and tell your story, because that is how we succeed. When people hear your stories and the stories of your loved ones and understand that it affects, as the senator points out, many people who are the poorest of the poor. It affects many people who are middle class.
Right.
It doesn't actually discriminate on a certain level on economics, because so many different people from different walks of life
That's right.
access essential services through Medicaid. And that's when you don't talk to your constituents and instead put your head in the sand, you don't know what you're voting for. And it's only now that people understand the importance of Medicaid and the importance of the Affordable Care Act more broadly. Mm-hmm. And that is why it's so important for people who are listening today to call, not tomorrow, but to call immediately and make sure your voices are heard. Keri, in your job, you're helping next-gen leaders like yourself get access to a good job. Do you interact with mentees and others who also rely on Medicaid?
Definitely. So as I mentioned, I work with students from all across the country who are at all sorts of schools and majoring in all types of areas, who literally just want to work, who literally just want to contribute and build a career and build a life. And one thing that I really want to make clear is that disability looks so many different ways, right? So I work with students who are chair users, who have medical devices that you very much see, and you can tell that they are recipients of things such as Medicaid and the ADA, and utilizing services and accommodations. I also work with students who you can't see everything that they utilize with these services. You don't know exactly how they're benefiting from it, but I can guarantee you every single individual knows somebody with a disability. And it is very likely that they have interacted with the Medicaid population in some type of way. My students need these services in order to be able to succeed. And you're threatening their success if you take this away from them. And I can guarantee you, I know a community who will not allow our generation to fail. And I know that we can do everything that we can to ensure that they have these services. So our students very much rely on it, whether that's through ensuring that they need additional finances for accommodations, whether that's just saying that they have their rights to access to a location. It is something that they very much rely upon.
Well, thank you. And again, your advocacy is so critical for our millennial generation, because there's so many movements that you are in the intersection of.
Right.
And you have done such a great job of creating that, what Dr. King called the inescapable garment of mutuality.
Definitely.
So I'm so appreciative of the work that you're doing. One of my favorite features of Democrats Live is when we go to the questions from the audience, and my colleague Heather is ready for some good ones.
We do. We have some questions. The first question comes from Janie from San Francisco, who says, what's the most important thing the disability community must do now to continue making progress towards full inclusion?
Senator, you want to start with that?
Well, the most important thing right now, Janie, is stopping this Trump care bill. There's nothing more important than that right now, because of the huge cuts that will be coming in Medicaid and taking away those support mechanisms. It is so crucial that we stop this. Right, if you want to know right now, and as Tom said, yeah, prayer is good, but it's like that Newt Rockne once said when he was the coach of the football team at Notre Dame a long time ago. He said, I found that prayer works best when you have big players. So you're right. we need you out there advocating and what'd you say? Good trouble?
Causing good trouble.
We need most important thing to do right now is cause good trouble.
Keri, did you want anything?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. It's my perspective that the way in which we will be successful, whether that's through the healthcare bill or the fight that will continue even after this, is through coalition. One of the things that I think is very important to recognize is that disability touches all people, all races, all sexual orientations, all genders, everything, everyone. And so how is it that we can combine the efforts of, say, for instance, a Black Lives Matter movement, organizing groups, and gender feminist groups, and disability? I feel like it's imperative that we find ways to bridge that gap, because disability touches all of us. And if we find ways to bridge that gap, the power of our voices will only grow. So I think it's not only a challenge for us to talk to the representative of Congress, but as community members, how are we going to come together to ensure that we have a louder voice and a louder representation?
Keri, if I might just add, one of the things we found when we were trying to pass the ADA back in the late 80s up to 90, there was a silent majority out there in small communities all over America that had a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, a sister, a brother with a disability, and they got it. They knew what we were trying to do. They weren't out on the battlefronts and stuff, but it's what you say, the community out there. Right. We need to reach into these communities and have that connectivity. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Good. Heather?
Great. Our next question comes from Anna from Philadelphia, who said the political world tells candidates that they don't need to expend energy talking to their base because those voters will vote for Democrats already. In talking about issues like the ACA and Medicaid, Democrats consistently tell stories of Caucasian families. What can we do from school board to Senate now to reach out to diverse constituents and include us in our party's advocacy instead of waiting until October to show up at our churches, temples, mosques, and community centers?
Well, maybe I'll jump on that question, because it does seem like a question that's tailor-made for Tom P. as opposed to Tom H. You know, as I was listening to Anna's question, I was reflecting on a visit I took in Detroit, where a woman at an African-American church that I was at said to me, in response to my question, what do we have to do better to up our game? Because the Democratic Party needs to up its game. We've lost too many elections, not just for president, but for school board, for mayors, for governors, et cetera. And she said, you know, you got to stop showing up every 4th October at my church and telling me that you care. And you know what? She's right.
She's right.
And we've got to talk. I mean, our most loyal constituency as Democratic Party are African Americans generally and African American women in particular. That's right. And we have to make sure that we are engaging everybody and listening to African American women, to African Americans generally, to folks in urban America, to folks in suburban America, to folks in rural America. And so what we're doing as a new DNC, number one, we've changed our mission statement. We're not simply the party that's here to elect the president every 4 years. We're the party that's here to help elect Democrats up and down the ticket, from the school board to the Senate. And you know what? When you elect good Democrats to school boards, you get much more enlightened disability rights policies. And when you don't elect good Democrats, and I know a lot of school board races are nonpartisan, but folks have figured out a way around that. And I've seen it firsthand because we sued a lot of school districts when I was at DOJ. And so this stuff matters. And talking to people, the woman in that church resonates with me, because we have to be a 12-month-a-year party. We've taken and we've removed the term off year from our lexicon as a Democratic Party. We are investing not only to help elect Ralph Northam in Virginia this fall, and I'm confident that he's going to win, but we're working to make sure that Justin Fairfax becomes the lieutenant governor, that Mark Herring gets reelected as the attorney general, that we make progress in many of the House of Delegates seats that are out there in Virginia, and there's a bumper crop of awesome Democrats, including diverse communities. There's the first candidate she would be the first Latina ever elected to the House of Delegates. We've been working with a number of African-American women, and one just won in House District 2 in a recount. She won by 14 votes in the primary because she organized, an African-American woman. And so this stuff matters. And the Democratic Party needs to reach out to everyone. And we have a every zip code strategy, and we need to do a better job. And that's exactly what we're doing right now, is investing. We need to organize. There's a difference between organizing and mobilizing. Mobilizing is that short-term sprint. Organizing is that 12-month-a-year relationship where you look and see what's on people's minds and how can we help affect in a positive way the issues that keep you up at night. That's what we're about as a Democratic Party.
Our next question comes from James, who's from here in D.C. And Keri, this might be a good question for you, too. He says the unemployment rate for people with disabilities here in the U.S. has remained stagnant since the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990 at 70%. What can the Democratic Party do to reduce the unemployment rate for people with disabilities so they can live good, successful, and meaningful lives?
So one thing I just want to follow up, I completely agree with what was just stated about, one, if I can throw a hashtag in there, hashtag trust black women, real talk. But two, it is about that relationship building. But in the midst of that relationship building and having these conversations, people can tell your authenticity by how you follow up with your actions and your promises. And so when it comes to ensuring that we do better with our employment rates, and the unemployment for people with disability is terrible. It's really bad. And when you break it down by things such as like the youth unemployment rate and by race, it gets just worse and worse. And so backing it up by actions is about how can we intentionally center those who need the most support, those who have been the most ignored in this process, those who we've questioned because of historical stereotypes and stigmas and things of that nature, and we're unsure because they look a certain way, because they act a certain way, you know, people in the disability community, our bodies don't always respond in what's quote unquote normal, you know, things of that nature. How can we ensure that those people are centered in this process? And we do that by advocating for them and saying, I know this person. They're amazing. They're great. I've had conversation with them and they can get the job done. And when we talk and hype up our people and know of their capabilities is when we start to break down those barriers that have caused the unemployment rate. So I think it's about building the relationships with them, backing it up with our actions.
You know, we spent a little time on this with a guy named Tom Harkin, and there was a regulation that the Labor Department put out 2 or 3 years ago, Section 503. And people in this audience, and I'm confident on this broadcast, are familiar with it. And it took too long. And what it has triggered, and I'll tell you one very quick story, and I won't mention this person by name because I know there's someone in this audience who knows this person. And this person led the charge against our regulation. And part of the talking points against our regulation, the regulation was simply, you've got to establish goals. And you got to make good faith efforts to hire qualified people with disabilities. And I underscore qualified people with disabilities. This wasn't about hiring unqualified people. And one of the first talking points I heard was, so you're going to make us hire truck drivers who have a vision impairment and can't see. You know, that's an insulting question. That's not what it's about. And the beauty of it is this person who helped lead the charge, once we were able to explain to him that, you know, through your current practices, the Keris of the world don't have opportunity. And you're screwing yourself because you're denying yourself the opportunity to get some real phenomenal talent. And that person got religion on this and has become one of our most zealous advocates for the employment of people with disabilities. And so it's breaking down legal barriers. It's breaking down attitudinal barriers. It's making sure we stop doing silly things in the federal government. Hey, good news. We're going to get you a job. Hey, bad news. the health care you get under Medicaid is going to get cut. So actually you're making less to go to work. That seems a little perverse to me. So we ought to make sure that we correct issues of that nature. And this is part of the unfinished business of the disability rights movement, is making sure we're aligning all of the incentives so that eligible people can get to work.
I think we have time for one last question. This last one comes from Kate, and she says, what is the most effective means of engaging the current administration on including people with disabilities? I'm sorry, that's a hard one.
I guess I'd say tweet. I don't know. I have no answer.
No, I mean,
I think I guess I would say again, keep on the barricades, keep the revolution going, keep making sure that you show up at protests. I have to tell you, back in the 80s, so many people gave their lives for the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think of people like Ed Roberts and Justin Dart. Well, now he didn't give his life, but basically did. Bob Kafka of ADAP, all these wonderful people. I mean, they laid their lives down for this. And they were at the barricades, and they weren't afraid to get arrested. They weren't afraid to block traffic and cause good trouble. You know, sometimes you got to do that. And I'm thinking maybe we need some more of that kind of advocacy right now to let this administration know that they can't just run over us, that we're there and we're going to stop them.
You're spot on, Senator. And again, you remember back in December and January of last year, they said they were going to repeal this by February. Mm-hmm. And the reason we're sitting here in the end of July, still having this debate, is because of you. People out across America who went out and told their stories. It's not just Democrats that have disabilities. It's not just Democrats that are confronting the opioid addiction. It's not just Democrats that have kids who are spectacular kids who happen to be on the autism spectrum. Mm-hmm. It's not just Democrats who have loved ones in nursing homes who are being paid for by Medicaid. And telling your stories. I have been so struck in my own job here as DNC chair. I didn't think people paid much attention to who the DNC chair was. And I've been getting stopped pretty regularly over the last 6 to 8 weeks. And 100% of the time, it's by someone who wants to tell me their story. And I have so many of them in my head. And that's why folks are taking notice. And this is real stuff. 32 million in the most recent Senate bill who lose coverage. I mean, this is real stuff. And so that's a perfect last question for this audience. I leave where I started. We've got to organize. And we've got to continue to advocate. And again, now, because time is of the essence, a motion to proceed, what they're going to try and do is pass something, anything, out of the Senate. And it may be a very, very small sliver, just so that they can have a bill that will enable them to have a conversation with the folks in the House who passed the mean bill. And those aren't my words; those are Donald Trump's words. Yeah. And and once you do that, if you allow that to happen, make no mistake about it, you're handing the keys to the kingdom to the totally misnamed Freedom Caucus. Because you know what? The ADA was freedom. You know, my friends in ADAPT, free our people. That's what Olmstead is about. Okay? It's about giving opportunities for people with disabilities to live in the community where they should and where they can. But folks, make no mistake about it. So when you are calling your senators, you vote to pass anything, and you're giving the keys to the Freedom Caucus. And when you give the keys to the Freedom Caucus, you are doing a colossal disservice, not only to the disability rights community, but to America. Mm-hmm. you're doing a colossal disservice to our values as a nation. And that is why this is one of the most important battles. I understood when I ran for this job that there were going to be times where we had to play a lot of defense. And I love playing offense. I prefer offense. That's why we're going to keep electing good Democrats.
That's right.
Okay?
That's right.
We can play more offense. But I'll tell you, some of the defense we play is the most important work that we will do. So we need folks to get out there and continue to do what you do and call your senators. Make sure you're doing it and do it right away and tell them your stories, because your stories are gut-wrenching. Your stories are compelling. Your stories of resilience are inspiring. And when we inspire, that's when we change minds and hearts. And that's why I continue to have unrelenting optimism at a time when some are struggling to try to get that optimism. We can do this, folks, but we can only do it together. And so on that note, keep organizing. And thank you for this special ADA edition of Democrats Live. Special thanks to my hero, Tom Harkin, my new hero, Keri, and to all of you in the audience. We'll see you next time on Democrats Live. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. That's great.
Thanks for being here, folks.